Histories make men wise, poets witty, the mathematics subtile, natural philosophy deep, moral grave, logic and rhetoric able to contend. Francis Bacon. Complex syllogisms, the dilemma. What is a dilemma? Our fourth and last type of compound syllogism is the dilemma. Of the four kinds of compound syllogisms, dilemmas are perhaps the most interesting. According to Ferdinand Schiller, the dilemma is the prettiest and dialectically the most effective form of conditional reasoning. A dilemma is a two-horned or two-edged argument which presents as a major premise a complex conjunctive proposition in which each of the conjuncts, the horns, is a conditional statement as well as a minor premise. A disjunctive proposition in which either the antecedents of the major premise are confirmed or its consequents are denied. The dilemma takes four forms. There are three rules with which dilemmas must comply, and there are three strategies that may be employed in answering them. The classification of dilemmas. Quantitatively, arguments can be divided into the simple and the complex. Qualitatively, they can be divided into constructive and the destructive. Taking both quantity and quality into account, therefore, there are four different forms of the dilemma. The simple constructive dilemma, the simple destructive dilemma, the complex constructive dilemma, the complex destructive dilemma. The simple constructive dilemma. A simple constructive dilemma is a dilemma in which both of the antecedents of the major premise are affirmed by the minor premise, but in which the consequents in both conjuncts of the major premise are the same. Here's an example of a simple constructive dilemma that is taken from the ancient case of Protagoras, the great Greek sophist, and Euthyphros, his pupil. Protagoras has agreed to teach Euthyphros on the following condition: that Euthyphros agree to pay Protagoras half his fee when his studies were completed, and the other half when Euthyphros had won his first case in court. Euthyphros paid Protagoras half his fee when the course was completed. But some time went by, and Euthyphros had still not paid Protagoras the other half of his fee, because Euthyphros had not yet tried a case in court. Protagoras, worried that he would never be paid the other half, brought suit against Euthyphros, forcing him to try his first case. Protagoras therefore argued as follows: Euthyphros must either win the case or lose it. If Euthyphros loses his case, then he should pay me, because the court will have decided against him. And if Euthyphros wins the case, then he should pay me in accordance with our original agreement. Therefore, in either case, he should pay me. Notice that here the minor premise is stated first. In constructive dilemmas, this is often done to avoid sounding awkward, but we will note its form by placing the major premise at the beginning. If P, then Q, and if R, then Q, either P or R, therefore Q. Notice that although there are two antecedents in the major premise, there's only one consequent, Q. Notice also that each disjunct in the second premise affirms the antecedent of each of the conditional statements in the first premise, yielding the consequent of both these conditional statements, Q. The simple destructive dilemma. A simple destructive dilemma is a dilemma in which both of the consequents of the major premise are denied in the minor premise, but in which the antecedents in both conjuncts of the major premise are the same. Here's an example. If I am to be happy, then I must please both God and men. But either I must displease God by pleasing man, or I must displease men by pleasing God. Therefore, I cannot be happy. In this case, the structure is somewhat different. If P, then Q, and if P, then R, either not Q or not R. Therefore, not P. In this case, although there are two consequents in the major premise, there's only one antecedent. In the minor premise, the two consequents are alternatively denied, thereby denying the common antecedent, P. The complex constructive dilemma. A complex constructive dilemma is a dilemma in which both of the antecedents of the major premise are affirmed by the minor premise, but in which the consequents in both conjuncts of the major premise are different. Here's an example of a complex constructive dilemma. Either Jesus will urge that the woman caught in adultery be stoned, or he will urge that she be pardoned. But if Jesus urges that the woman caught in adultery be stoned, he will be unpopular with the people because of his severity. And if he urges that she be pardoned, then he will be criticized by the Pharisees for disregarding the law of Moses. Therefore, either Jesus will be unpopular with the people for his severity, or he will be criticized by the Pharisees for disregarding the law of Moses. Once again, since this is a constructive dilemma, we see the minor premise stated first. In symbolic notation, the complex constructive dilemma, looks like this. If P then Q, and if R then S, either P or R, therefore either Q or S. Notice that there are two antecedents and two consequents in the major premise. Notice also that each disjunct in the second premise affirms the antecedent of each of the conditional statements in the first premise, yielding the consequent of both these conditional statements, which includes both consequents from the major premise, Q and S. The complex destructive dilemma. A complex destructive dilemma is a dilemma in which both of the consequents of the major premise are denied in the minor premise, yielding the negation of the antecedent in both conjuncts of the major premise, which are different, in the conclusion. Here's an example. If a man is wise, he will not speak irreverently of holy things in jest. If a man is good, he will not do it in earnest. But he must either speak in jest or in earnest. Therefore, he is not wise or not good. The form of the complex destructive dilemma is as follows. If P, then Q, and if R, then S, either not Q or not S, therefore not P or not R. Rules for the dilemma. There are 3 rules that must be followed in order for a dilemma to be considered properly constructed, each pertaining to a distinct part of the syllogism. Rule number 1. Concerning the major premise, the consequence in the major premise must follow legitimately from the antecedents. In other words, the major premise must be true. Rule number 2. Concerning the minor premise. The disjunction in the minor premise must be complete. In other words, there must be no third possibility. Rule number 3. Concerning the conclusion. The conclusion must be exclusive. In other words, it should be the only one that can be inferred from the premises. The rule violated, if any, will determine the approach an opponent can take to refute the dilemma. Grasping the dilemma by the horns. The dilemma is sometimes referred to as syllogismus cornutus, literally horned argument. The horns of a dilemma are the 2 conditional statements in the major premise. If a dilemma violates the first rule, if the consequents in the major premise do not follow legitimately from the antecedents, then the appropriate way to respond to the dilemma is to grasp it by the horns. Grasping the horns involves questioning the truth of either one of the conditional statements in the major premise. Let's take an example of a dilemma that violates rule number 1 and grasp it by the horns. Let's take the example we use for simple destructive dilemmas. If I am to be happy, then I must please both God and men. But either I must displease God by pleasing men, or I must displease men by pleasing God. Therefore, I cannot be happy. In grasping a dilemma by the horns, we attack one of the conditional statements in the major premise. Let's attack the second horn. If I am to be happy, then I must please men. Notice that the 2 conditional statements in the major premise are sort of tangled together. We merely untangle them. We must, if we remember the truth conditions of conditional statements, be able to establish that the antecedent is true and the consequent false. In this case, we could claim that it is entirely possible to be happy, affirming the antecedent, and not please men, denying the consequent. You could come up with examples of this from history of men who please God but not men, and were quite happy. Escaping between the horns of a dilemma. If the dilemma violates rule number 2, that the disjunction in the minor premise must be complete, then we must deal with it by slipping between the horns. This method avoids the necessity of having to question the truth of either the 2 conditional statements in the major premise by attacking, instead, the disjunctive statement in the minor premise. This is done by proposing that there is some other alternative than the two offered in the disjunction, thereby avoiding the conclusion. Let's take Jesus' dilemma again. Either Jesus will urge that the woman caught in adultery be stoned, or he will urge that she be pardoned. But if Jesus urges that the woman caught in adultery be stoned, he will be unpopular with the people because of his severity. And if he urges that she be pardoned, then he will be criticized by the Pharisees for disregarding the law of Moses. Therefore, either Jesus will be unpopular with the people for his severity, or he will be criticized by the Pharisees for disregarding the law of Moses. What, in fact, did Jesus do? According to the Gospel of Mark, he neither urged that the woman be stoned, nor that she be pardoned. Instead, he did a third thing. He said, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." In this way, Jesus escaped between the horns of the dilemma. The counter dilemma. If the dilemma violates rule number 3, that the conclusion must be exclusive, in other words, it should be the only one that can be inferred from the premises, then we must deal with it by suggesting a counter dilemma. The counter dilemma is one of the most sophisticated and clever operations in logic. It is accomplished by rearranging the propositions in the original dilemma to produce a very different conclusion. Unlike other methods of responding to dilemmas, this method does not question the truth of any of the argument's component propositions, nor does it suggest any third alternatives not included in the premises. It is not, therefore, a direct refutation of a dilemma. It merely points out that there is another conclusion that can be derived from the same truths assumed in the premises. Let's take a look back at the dilemma proposed by Protagoras. Youthless must either win the case or lose it. If Youthless loses his case, then he should pay me, because the court will have decided against him, and if Youthless wins the case, then he should pay me in accordance with our original agreement. Therefore, in either case, he should pay me. Technically, this dilemma violates rule number 3 since the conclusion is not exhaustive. It does not exhaust the possibilities of what may be concluded. Therefore, a counter dilemma may be offered. In fact, it is said that Youthless, in response to Protagoras, did indeed propose a counter dilemma, showing that Protagoras had taught him well. Here is Youthless's response. I must either win the case or lose it. If I win the case, then I should not have to pay Protagoras on account of the judge's ruling that I shouldn't have to pay. And if I lose the case, then I shouldn't have to pay, according to our original agreement, that I would pay only when I won my first case. Therefore, in either case, I should not have to pay. Notice that from the same set of truths, Protagoras and Youthless come to completely different conclusions. The force of the counter dilemma is to show that your opponent's conclusion is not the only one that can follow from the truths he states, that another truth will set of truths more favorable to your side is consistent with these truths. But how is it done? There are 2 ways to do it, depending on whether the dilemma is constructive or destructive. Procedure number 1. If the dilemma is constructive, then the consequence of the major premise may be switched and negated. Procedure number 2. If the dilemma is destructive, then the antecedents of the major premise may be switched and negated. In the case of Youthless, since it was a constructive dilemma, the first procedure was followed. Transposition of the 2 terms in the conclusion is not really necessary, since transposing disjuncts does not affect the statement logically. It just makes it look cleaner. A counter dilemma involving a destructive dilemma would look like this. In the case of both constructive and destructive dilemmas, if the dilemma is simple, switching the terms in the conclusion is unnecessary since there is only one term in the conclusion. But negation must still be performed. Remember that a counter dilemma is an option only when rule number 3 is violated. Summary. A dilemma is an argument which presents as the major premise a complex conjunctive proposition in which each of the conjuncts is a conditional statement as well as a minor premise. A disjunctive proposition in which either the antecedents of the major premise are alternatively confirmed or its consequence denied. The dilemma takes 4 forms: the simple constructive dilemma, the simple destructive dilemma, the complex constructive dilemma, and the complex destructive dilemma. There are 3 rules for dilemmas. Rule 1, concerning the major premise, the consequence and the major premise must follow legitimately from the antecedents. In other words, the major premise must be true. Rule number 2, concerning the minor premise. The minor premise must be complete. In other words, there must be no third possibility. Rule number 3, concerning the conclusion. The conclusion must be exclusive. In other words, it should be the only one that can be inferred from the premises. Depending on which of these rules a dilemma violates, there are 3 ways of responding to them. Response 1, grasping by the horns, if there is a violation of Rule 1. Response number 2, escaping between the horns, if there is a violation of Rule 2. And response 3, counter dilemma, if there is a violation of Rule number 3.